Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to be talking about something that's kind of a big deal, a tough topic for a lot of folks, and that's knowing when it might be the right time to leave a church.
Ooh, yeah. That is a heavy one for sure.
Yeah, and we're going to be taking a look at this video by Alan Parr. It's called Six Obvious Signs That It's Definitely Time to Leave Your Church. It's on his YouTube channel called The Beat. So in this deep dive, we're going to go through those 6 reasons that he gives, trying to unpack them a little bit.
I'm interested to see what he has to say because, like you said, this is something that a lot of people struggle with. It can be really hard to know when is the right time.
Yeah, let's jump right into it. His first reason is disagreement with the vision of the church. And he points out that the word division literally means like 2 visions.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was a good point.
Yeah, and I think that's really at the heart of a lot of conflict in churches.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you have 2 different groups of people who have 2 completely different ideas about where the church should be going
Right.
and what it should be doing, it can create a lot of tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And Parr uses an example from the Old Testament, the story of Korah's rebellion against Moses in the book of Numbers.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Where basically Korah is saying, hey, we're all holy here. Why does Moses get to be in charge?
Right. It's that classic power struggle.
Yeah.
That you see throughout history and even today in churches. It makes you think, how often does that actually play out?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question for anybody listening. Have you experienced something like that in your church, where there's maybe some kind of power struggle, or you feel like there are these really different visions for where the church is going, and is that causing tension?
Yeah, because I think sometimes those disagreements can actually be healthy,
Right.
like iron sharpens iron, as they say.
Right.
But when it becomes divisive, when it starts to really fracture the community, that's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and Parr goes on to say that if you find yourself really at odds with the leadership and the direction of the church, it can be hard to support them, not just like with your time and your energy, but even financially.
Yeah, I could see that. Because if you don't trust the leadership, if you don't believe in where they're taking the church, why would you want to invest your money there?
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the second reason that he gives, which is doctrinal disputes. Sometimes it's not about the leadership so much as what the church is actually teaching.
Yeah. And he makes a good point about the difference between primary and secondary doctrines.
Right. So like primary doctrines would be those core beliefs, those like non-negotiables of Christianity.
Yeah, like the authority of the Bible, the divinity of Jesus, the way of salvation, those really essential beliefs that most Christians agree on.
Right. And then you have the secondary doctrines, which are still important, but there's more room for like different interpretations.
Like things like, baptism or women in ministry or spiritual gifts or even, end times theology. There's a lot of different perspectives on those things.
Yeah. And Parr uses those as examples in his video, those kinds of issues. And I think denominations kind of play a role in this.
Oh, absolutely.
Because a lot of times, different denominations came about because of disagreements over these secondary issues.
Right. That's a good point.
And so Parr isn't necessarily saying that one view is right or wrong on these secondary issues.
Right.
But he is saying that if there is strong disagreement in these areas, it could be a sign that maybe this particular church isn't the best fit for you.
That makes sense.
Okay.
And I think it's good for everyone listening
Mhm.
to think about, what are those non-negotiable doctrines for you?
Yeah.
Like, are there certain beliefs that you feel so strongly about that you just couldn't compromise on them? Because if a church is teaching something that you fundamentally disagree with,
Yeah.
that's going to create a lot of internal conflict for you.
Absolutely. And so that leads into the third reason that Parr gives, which is feeling like your spiritual gifts are being underutilized. And his argument here is that everybody have unique gifts and abilities that are given by God.
Right.
And that church should be a place where we can use those gifts to serve others.
I love that point because it really speaks to the idea of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
We all have different parts to play. We all have different gifts to offer. And when those gifts are being utilized, that's when the church can really function at its best.
Yeah. And Parr actually uses the word stonewalled. Like you're trying to contribute, but you just keep hitting a wall.
Oh, I've definitely felt that before.
Yeah. Have you ever felt that at a church?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like you want to get involved.
Yeah.
You want to use your gifts, but it's like nobody's really interested. or they don't know what to do with you.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a matter of the church not being set up or structured in a way to use those gifts.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a lack of awareness.
Mm.
Maybe people don't even realize that you have those gifts or that you're willing to serve.
Right.
So I think communication is really important in those situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Parr's point is that, if you feel like you're constantly hitting that wall, maybe it's a sign that your gifts might be better suited somewhere else.
Yeah, and that can be a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to realize that, maybe this isn't the right place for me to flourish
Yeah.
and to really use my gifts to their full potential.
Right. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you or that you're not valuable.
Exactly. It's just about finding the right fit.
Yeah. And, speaking of feeling valued and connected, that brings us to Parr's fourth reason, which is lack of community. I think for a lot of people, church is their primary source of community and support.
Oh, for sure. It's like a second family for many people.
Yeah. So if you're not feeling that connection, it can be incredibly isolating.
Absolutely. And that could be a big red flag that something's not right.
Yeah.
Parr asks some tough questions here. Like he says, have we actually put in the effort to build relationships within our church? Have we joined a small group, attended events,
Yeah.
reached out to get to know others?
So he's saying that community doesn't just magically happen.
Right. It takes intentionality. It takes action on our part.
Yeah.
But I also think it's important to look at the church itself. Is there a culture of community there?
Yeah.
Are people welcoming? Do they reach out to newcomers? Or is it kind of like a cliquey, exclusive environment?
Yeah, that's a good point because sometimes you can have people who really want community, but if the church itself is not set up to foster that way, it can be really difficult. I
Yeah.
like how you described it earlier, like the difference between a house and a home.
Oh, yeah.
A house is just a structure, but a home is a place where you feel loved, accepted.
Right.
You belong.
It's that sense of belonging.
Yeah, and that's really what we're all looking for, isn't it?
Yeah. And if you're not finding that at your church, that can be a really tough situation.
All right, so moving into some heavier territory. Now, this is Parr's fifth reason, abuse of power.
Yeah, this is a big one.
And I want to acknowledge this can be a sensitive and painful topic. We know that abuse of power can happen anywhere,
Unfortunately, yeah.
and churches are not immune to that. And Parr mentions examples like harassment, control, manipulation.
Right.
But it can also be more subtle than that.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes it's like a slow creep,
Yeah.
It's not always blatant.
Right. But he makes a really important distinction, which is that being challenged or corrected by leadership is not the same as abuse.
Right. That's a good point because sometimes you need to be challenged,
Yeah.
you need to be corrected,
Right.
but there's a difference between that and being manipulated or exploited.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction to make because sometimes we can get those things confused.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to the motivation of the leader.
Right.
Are they truly trying to help you grow and mature in your faith, or are they trying to control you and manipulate you for their own gain?
And Parr also points out that this abuse of power can be financial exploitation or spiritual manipulation,
Right.
which are obviously even harder to identify.
Yeah, those are really tough situations to be in because it can be so hard to know what's really going on.
Yeah. And, just want to say to anybody listening, if you're experiencing any form of abuse within your church, you're not alone.
Yeah, please reach out for help.
There are resources available. There are organizations like GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment,
Right.
that offers support and resources for people who have been harmed in a church context.
Yeah, because nobody should have to go through that alone.
Absolutely. So just remember that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Yes.
And it's important to prioritize your own safety and well-being.
Absolutely.
All right, so moving on to Parr's sixth and final reason, unresolved sin. And he's talking specifically about unresolved sin within the leadership. And he uses a powerful analogy here. He compares sin to leaven that spreads through dough.
Oh, I like that.
If sin is ignored or covered up, it can contaminate the whole community.
Yeah, that's a really good visual.
Yeah.
And it's so true. When sin is allowed to fester, it can really poison the whole atmosphere of a church.
Yeah. And he brings up a pretty intense example, a man sleeping with his father's wife.
Yeah.
Which, even in today's world, that would be considered a pretty serious moral transgression. And his point is that this sin needs to be addressed not just for the sake of the individual, but for the health of the whole church.
And that's where that balance of grace and accountability comes in.
Right.
Because we want to be gracious, we want to be forgiving,
Right.
but we also have to hold people accountable for their actions.
Yeah. And Parr is stressing that if a church consistently fails to address sin, particularly within its leadership,
Right.
it creates this culture of hypocrisy and distrust.
Yeah. And that undermines the whole mission of the church.
Yeah.
People are going to start to question everything
Right.
if they see that the leaders are not being held to the same standards as everyone else.
Right. So I think what's crucial here is that we understand that, yes, we are called to extend grace and forgiveness,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that we ignore or condone harmful behavior.
Right.
There's a difference between covering up sin and offering a path to repentance and restoration.
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah. So we've unpacked a lot of Alan Parr's insights on when it might be time to leave a church. And I know this is a lot to process.
Yeah.
Take some time to reflect on what resonated with you the most.
Yeah.
Think about your own experiences. And as we move on to part 2, we'll delve deeper into some of the nuances of these decisions.
Yeah. We'll explore what healthy church leadership looks like. And we'll offer some practical guidance on how to find a church that's a good fit for you.
So stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive.